The station smelled like recycled air and old metal. Junho had noticed that the first time he came here, 7 years ago, and nothing had changed. The conclave's grand assembly station floated in orbit around a dim red star that gave off just enough light to remind you it was still alive. It was not a beautiful place. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be functional, and even that, Junho thought, was a generous description. He walked through the main corridor with his small bag over one shoulder and his datapad in his hand. He had read everything on that datapad at least 4 times. Every number, every legal article, every record of every meeting Earth had ever attended at the station. He was 31 years old, and he had been doing this job for 2 years, but sometimes it felt like he had been doing it his whole life. Maybe because his father had done the same job before him. And his father's mentor before that. The corridor opened into a wide waiting area, full of aliens from dozens of species. Some were tall and thin with pale skin and large eyes. Some were short and heavy, moving slowly on thick legs. Some had more arms than Junho could count. They all wore some version of formal diplomatic clothing, colors and cuts that marked their species, their rank, their status. None of them looked at Junho when he walked in. Not because they didn't see him, because they didn't think he was worth looking at. He found his seat in the lower tier of the assembly chamber. The chamber was shaped like a bowl, with the most powerful species seated highest and the least powerful seated at the bottom. Earth had been at the bottom since the beginning. Tier 7, the lowest recognized classification for a spacefaring civilization. There were species below Tier 7, but they weren't allowed in the chamber at all. Humanity was exactly one step above invisible. The session began. A senior Vreth delegate named Counselor Drav stood at the central podium and opened the meeting with the usual long speech about conclave unity and shared progress. Drav was tall, gray-skinned, and spoke in a slow, deep voice that made everything he said sound important even when it wasn't. Junho had studied every public record of Drav's speeches. The content rarely changed. The tone never did. When the review session opened, Junho stood and submitted Earth's formal request. He had filed the paperwork 3 months in advance as required. He had included every supporting document. He had cross-referenced every article of conclave law that backed the request. Earth was asking for a tier reclassification, not to the top, not even close. Just up. Just a few steps. Enough to access the faster relay lanes. Enough to have a vote on decisions that directly affected human colonies. The chamber was quiet for a moment after he finished speaking. Then Drav made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the kind of sound someone makes when they hear something mildly entertaining, a soft exhale through the nose, the corners of the mouth pulling back just slightly. Several other delegates made similar sounds. A low murmur moved through the upper tiers. Drav looked at Junho the way someone looks at a child who has said something confidently wrong. He said, in careful, translated standard, that humanity's average lifespan made long-term political planning difficult for them to understand. He said that the conclave's tier system was not about willingness, but about demonstrated capacity over time. He said that 30 years was, in galactic terms, barely a conversation. He said all of this without raising his voice or showing any particular emotion. It was worse that way. Junho stood still and listened to every word. He did not smile. He did not frown. He held his datapad and looked at Drav and said nothing until Drav was finished. Then he said calmly that humanity understood multi-generational thinking very well. He said that humans had invented the concept of generational debt, the idea that a wrong done to one generation is owed back by the next. He said that humans were, in his experience, very good at collecting on debts. The chamber went quiet again, not because anyone felt threatened, because the statement was unexpected and strange and no one quite knew what to do with it. Then the quiet broke and the session moved on. The request was denied. The tier stayed the same. Junho sat back down. His datapad showed a message from Sohai, who was watching the session from the observation deck above. She was Earth's cultural analyst, the person whose job it was to understand not just what aliens said, but what they meant and what they assumed and what they had never bothered to think about. Her message was short. It said, "They do not know that we do this. They have never met a species that holds a grudge across generations." Jun-ho read it once and put the datapad face down on his knee. After the session, he walked to a small writing room near the Earth delegation's quarters and sat at a plain table. He opened a standard conclave grievance form, the same form he had used 46 times before. He filled it out carefully. He wrote the date, the nature of the complaint, the names of the delegates involved, the specific articles of conclave law that had been violated by the denial of a legally submitted review, and the potential impact on human citizens. He wrote in clear, simple language. He did not use emotional words. He did not say he was angry, even though he was. Anger, he had learned, made documents easier to dismiss. He filed the form through the official conclave system. He received an automatic confirmation. He printed a copy and placed it in a physical folder he kept in his bag. The folder was thick. It had been thick for years. He had folders at home, too, organized by year, sitting on a shelf in his apartment in Seoul. His father had kept folders like that. Jun-ho had grown up watching his father fill them out. He had once asked his father why, since no one ever answered them. His father had said that the answering wasn't the point. The record was the point. The record was everything. The next morning, Jun-ho attended 2 smaller sessions and 1 informal meeting with an Elhari counselor named Vale who seemed, unlike most of the others, to actually read the documents put in front of him. Vale didn't say much, but he asked a few careful questions about human colony populations and Earth's infrastructure capacity. Jun-ho answered each question fully and precisely. He noticed that Vale wrote things down. That was unusual. On his last evening at the station, Jun-ho stood at the wide observation window at the end of the delegation quarters corridor. The red star outside was dim and far away. A few transport ships drifted past slowly, heading toward the relay lanes that Earth wasn't allowed to use. He watched them for a while. Sohai came and stood beside him. She asked him if he was all right. He said yes. She asked him if he believed anything would ever change. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that it didn't matter what he believed. It mattered what he prepared for. She nodded and didn't say anything else. They stood there for a while longer, watching the ships move through the dark. Behind them, in the official records of the Conclave's 44th General Session, grievance number 47 from the human delegation had been logged, timestamped, and filed in a category labeled low priority. No action required. It sat there in the system, next to the 46 that came before it. No one at the station gave it a second thought. Jun-ho gave it every thought he had. The outer reach was a bad place to be alone. It was a long stretch of empty space between 2 dead systems, assigned to human patrol routes because no one else wanted it. There was nothing there worth protecting, no rare minerals, no useful planets, no strategic relay points. The Conclave gave Earth the outer reach the way someone gives away old furniture, not as a gift, just to get it out of the way. The transport ship Hisal was 3 days into a routine supply run through the outer reach when the Vreth ships appeared. There were 4 of them, unmarked, running without identification codes. The Hisal's captain, a quiet man named Tiang who had been doing supply runs for 9 years, tried to hail them twice. No response. On the 3rd attempt, the Vreth ships opened fire. The attack lasted less than 6 minutes. When it was over, 17 crew members were dead. The ship was disabled, drifting. 9 survivors were taken. One of them was Yoonji, a structural specialist who had been on her 2nd off-world assignment. She was 26 years old. She had a small plan on her desk at home that her younger brother watered when she was away. The Vreth called ships like theirs privateers. The Vreth government called them independent contractors. Everybody in the Conclave knew what they actually were. Nobody said it out loud because saying it out loud meant doing something about it. When the news reached Earth, Minyu, Earth's Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, was in the middle of a budget meeting. He stopped the meeting, read the report twice, and then sat very still for about 30 seconds. The people in the room said later that it was the stillness that frightened them. Not anger, not noise. Just a man going very quiet in a very specific way. Minyu filed an emergency motion with the Conclave the same day. The motion asked for immediate investigation and the return of the 9 surviving crew members. The conclave's administrative office received the motion, processed it, and sent back an official response within the week. The response informed Earth that the matter had been placed in the standard review queue. Under conclave procedural law, written long before humans joined, and never updated, the standard review period for incidents involving unverified private actors was 4 years. 4 years. Minyu read that number and set the paper down on his desk and looked out the window at the city below him. He picked up a pen and wrote one sentence on a notepad. He tore the page off, folded it, and put it in his pocket. Nobody knew what was written on it. Years later, people guessed. Most guessed wrong. He appeared before the conclave chamber 10 days after the attack. He stood at the lower-tier podium, the same one Junho always used, and addressed the full assembly in a calm, even voice. He said that Earth appreciated the conclave's process. He said that Earth understood the importance of procedure. He said that Earth would handle the matter internally, through its own available channels, and that it did not wish to burden the conclave's review queue with urgency that the conclave's schedule could not accommodate. He bowed slightly and returned to his seat. The chamber interpreted this as acceptance. Several delegates spoke among themselves afterward, nodding that humanity seemed to be maturing, learning to work within the system, learning patience. The Vreth delegate sent a brief, polite note to the conclave's secretary expressing satisfaction that the incident would be handled through proper channels. None of them understood what Minyu had actually said. Commander Deal had understood it immediately. He had been waiting for exactly that sentence, the word internally, for 18 months. Deal was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cut gray hair and eyes that made people uncomfortable when he looked at them too long. He didn't waste words. He didn't waste time. He had spent a year and a half building 3 ships in a private bay in the asteroid belt outside Mars, using a legal framework that Junho and Minyu had spent years constructing. One that technically complied with every conclave transparency rule, while revealing absolutely nothing of importance. 48 hours after Minyu's speech, Deal's 3 ships entered Vreth privateer space. They did not broadcast identification. They did not issue demands. They moved fast, they hit hard, and they knew exactly where they were going because Sohai had spent 4 months analyzing every piece of publicly available Vreth shipping data until she found a pattern, a route that repeated just slightly too often, a station that never appeared in official records but showed up as a background reference in 6 separate Vreth cargo manifests. The extraction took 72 hours. Deal's team went in, found the station, found the prisoners, and brought them out. Yunji was found in a holding cell on the lower level of the station. She had a broken rib and a cut above her left eye that had been badly cleaned. She was awake and walking on her own when they reached her. When the extraction team entered her cell, she looked at them for a moment and then said, in a flat voice, that she had started to wonder if anyone was coming. The soldier who opened her cell door said they had come as fast as they could. She nodded and asked if anyone had a spare jacket because it had been very cold. Before leaving, Deal's ships destroyed 2 privateer stations. Not the people, the structures. Every person on both stations was given 30 minutes to evacuate in their own escape pods. The structures were then taken apart with focused precision. When the Vreth scrambled a response fleet, they arrived to find wreckage, empty space, and a single message buoy floating where the stations used to be. The buoy was broadcasting on all conclave-accessible frequencies. The message was short. It said, "This is what humans do with wounds. We heal, then we remember, then we act." The Vreth Dominion lodged a formal complaint with the conclave within the week. They called it an unprovoked military action against sovereign infrastructure. They demanded sanctions. They demanded an apology. Minyu submitted Earth's response the following day. It was not an apology. It was a counter-complaint 47 pages long, each page addressing one of Earth's previously filed grievances, now updated with precise legal annotations. Every annotation cited a specific article of conclave law. Every citation pointed to a specific violation that the Vreth Dominion had committed, and for which no action had ever been taken. The document was dry and detailed and completely, devastatingly accurate. The Vreth delegate went quiet. Their legal team went quieter. An Elhari counselor named Vale, the same one who had asked Junho careful questions the previous year, requested a private meeting with Sohai. He asked her, in a measured and genuinely curious way, why humans hadn't simply waited for the conclave's review process to work. He wasn't being dismissive. He actually seemed to want to understand. Sohai looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We did wait, for 30 years. She asked him if he had thought that was going to be permanent. Vale didn't answer. He wrote something in his notebook and thanked her for her time. Later, in his private correspondence, which Sohai would not see for another 2 years, he wrote that the meeting with her was the moment he understood that humanity was not what the conclave had assumed. He wrote that the conclave had looked at human patience and called it weakness. He wrote that he was no longer confident that was correct. Yunji returned to Earth on a medical transport. She spent 3 weeks recovering. On the day she was released from the medical center, she stood outside in the morning air and called her brother. He told her the plant on her desk was still alive. She said good. She asked him not to move it. He said he wouldn't. She stood in the street for a while after they hung up, just breathing the air, just standing still. Later, she would ask to be reassigned to the diplomatic liaison office. She would say she had things to say that needed to be said in rooms where decisions were made. Nobody who knew what she had been through argued with her. Back at the conclave station, grievance number 47 was still sitting in the system, unresolved. So were the other 46. But for the first time in 30 years, people were starting to read them. Not because they felt guilty. Because they were starting to feel something else entirely. Something they hadn't expected to feel about a Tier 7 species. Something that felt a little like concern. The conclave's investigation started the way all conclave investigations started, slowly, formally, and with great confidence that it would find exactly what it expected to find. What it expected to find was a small fleet, improvised, hastily assembled, the kind of thing a desperate, under-resourced species threw together when pushed past its limit. Something that could be noted, flagged, and used as justification for a brief diplomatic reprimand, just enough to keep appearances tidy without actually changing anything. Counselor Vale was assigned to lead the investigation. He accepted the assignment without complaint. He had accepted difficult assignments before, and he was thorough in a way that most of his colleagues respected in theory but found inconvenient in practice. He packed his records, booked passage toward the Sol system, and began reading everything available about human military and engineering history on the journey over. He arrived expecting a small bay with 3 ships. What he found, after 3 weeks of interviews and facility reviews, that Earth's government was legally required to permit under conclave transparency law, changed the way he understood the word preparation. Nari met him at the entrance to the main engineering facility in the asteroid belt. She was 38 years old, with short hair and grease on the side of her hand that she hadn't fully washed off. She spoke to Vale in careful standard, with the kind of directness that some alien species found rude and others found refreshing. Vale found it refreshing. She showed him everything she was required to show him and answered every question he asked. She was polite. She was also, he noticed, completely unafraid. The facility was not small. It had taken Vale 2 days just to walk through the main sections. There were hull bays large enough to fit 6 conclave standard warships side by side. There were material processing plants running around the clock. There were engineering labs that smelled like hot metal and burned circuits, and something sweet that Vale couldn't identify. There were hundreds of people working, human beings who looked tired and focused, and moved through the facility the way people move through a place they've been going to for a long time. The ships themselves were the part that Vale stood in front of for a long time without speaking. They were not what conclave standard ships looked like. They were shaped differently, leaner, with hull plating arranged in overlapping layers that Vale had never seen used that way before. The engine configurations were unusual. The propulsion math, when Nari walked him through it on a wall screen, was not what any conclave school taught. It was faster. In some areas, significantly faster. In one area, a specific type of short-range acceleration that Vale's people had considered a hard physical limit for decades. Human engineers had simply found a different way around the problem. He asked Nari how they had managed this with the base technology the Conclave had provided. The Conclave's technology transfers to Earth had been, as Vale well knew, second-rate, outdated by 15 to 20 years at the time of transfer. He had always assumed this meant human technology would lag behind by at least that much. Nari was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We didn't have better tools, so we learned to think better." Vale wrote that down. He asked her how long this had been going on. She said about 20 years. He asked her why 20 years. She said because that was when the engineering team sat down, looked at what the Conclave had given them, and decided that waiting for something better was not a plan. He asked what changed. She thought about it and said that nothing changed. That was the point. Nothing changed from outside, so they changed from inside. While Vale was still conducting his investigation, things outside became more complicated. A Vreth fleet, not privateers this time, but an actual Vreth military formation, smaller and unofficial but real, moved into the outer relay corridor near Earth's farthest colony points. They called it a navigation exercise. Nobody believed that, but under Conclave law, a navigation exercise in open space required no prior notification and could not be legally classified as aggression. It was the kind of move the Vreth had made before, against other species. Usually it ended with the other species pulling back, filing a complaint, and accepting a quiet loss of access to the corridor. The Vreth fleet positioned itself near Relay Station Nogo, a small human-operated communications hub that had been running for 11 years. There were 22 people on the station. The Vreth ships did not fire. They simply parked close enough that the station crew couldn't leave without passing through the Vreth formation. It was a pressure move, a reminder of who could do what to whom. The ESV Unyielding arrived 4 hours later. It came alone. There was no second ship, no support formation. Just one human vessel moving in at steady speed, broadcasting standard navigation codes, behaving completely normally until it was between the Vreth fleet and the station. Then it stopped. And it stayed stopped. It didn't fire. It didn't hail the Vreth ships with warnings or demands. It simply parked itself in the space between them and the station and refused to move. The Vreth fleet commander sent a standard displacement request, a formal message telling the Unyielding to clear the path. The Unyielding's response was 3 words in standard: "We are stationary." The standoff lasted about 2 hours. Then the Vreth fleet moved to go around the Unyielding to reach the station from another angle. The Unyielding moved to match them. The Vreth moved again. The Unyielding matched again. At some point in this process, the Vreth commander apparently decided that this was not going the way navigation exercises were supposed to go, and ordered the fleet to make a direct move through the Unyielding's position, an aggressive action that would have forced the human ship to either fire or flee. What happened in the next 11 minutes was something that Vale read about in the incident report later, and had to read twice, because his first reading didn't seem right. The Unyielding did not flee. It did not take significant damage. In 11 minutes of engagement with a 6-ship Vreth military formation, one human vessel disabled 4 ships, forced the other 2 to withdraw, and came out of it with a hull breach in a non-critical section and 1 broken power relay. No human crew members died. 3 were injured. 2 of those injuries were from people getting thrown across a room during a hard turn. The Vreth fleet retreated. On Relay Station Nogo, in the middle of all of this, a civilian engineer named Yuna had a different kind of problem. The station's communications array had been damaged in the early pressure moves, bumped by a Vreth ship that came too close on purpose. The array was the station's link to Earth's command network. Without it, the station crew couldn't relay tactical information, and the Unyielding was operating partially blind. Yuna was 29 years old and had been on the station for 8 months. She had no military training. What she had was 7 years of experience fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable. She pulled the array apart with 2 other crew members, found 4 components that still worked, and rebuilt the signal connection from pieces that were not designed to work together, using manual stellar positioning charts from the station's physical backup library and math she did on paper, because the station's computer was rebooting. The signal came back up 40 minutes into the engagement. Deal, watching from the command ship further back, received the relay and said, very briefly, "Good work." He was not a man who said things like good work unless he meant it. When the incident report reached the conclave, Vale was still in the asteroid belt, still taking notes. He read the report in his temporary office, set it down, and sat with it for a long time. Then he opened his investigation summary and wrote the final section. He wrote that he was recommending immediate reclassification of the human species. He wrote that this recommendation was not based primarily on their ships, or their tactics, or their engineering, although all of these were more significant than the conclave had understood. He wrote that the recommendation was based on something else, on what the ships and the tactics and the engineering represented. On the fact that a civilization had looked at 30 years of being treated as unimportant and had responded not with anger, not with despair, but with quiet, deliberate, long-term preparation. They had expected to be wronged. They had planned for it. They had kept their plans invisible, and they had waited until they were ready. He closed his file, packed his notes, and booked passage back to the assembly station. He had a report to file. For the first time in his career, he was not confident how the conclave would receive it. But he was going to file it anyway. The Grand Assembly Station was full in a way it had never been for a session about Earth. Every delegation had sent its full team. The upper tiers were crowded with senior counselors who usually sent junior representatives to routine sessions. The observation deck above was packed with staff, analysts, and a few species that had no formal vote but had requested guest seating regardless. The chamber had a specific kind of energy that only came when something genuinely important was about to happen, the kind of important that rearranged things and couldn't be taken back afterward. Junho walked in with 4 people behind him. Minyu, steady and composed, carrying nothing but a single datapad. Sohai, who had spent the past 2 weeks sleeping very little and reading everything. Deal, who walked like someone who had spent his life in corridors where things could go wrong, and who was the only person in the delegation who had not dressed up for the occasion. He wore his standard field uniform, which Junho had not asked him to change because he understood why Deal had chosen it. And Hyun, the youngest member of the delegation, 24 years old, sharp-eyed, who had started as a junior aide 18 months ago and had spent every day since then learning at a pace that impressed everyone around him. They took their seats at the lower-tier podium, the same seats they always had, the Tier 7 seats, the seats at the far end of the bottom row, closest to the exits, furthest from the central podium. Junho stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not use dramatic language. He spoke in standard, clearly and slowly, and what he said was simply this: that he intended to formally address all 47 grievances filed by Earth's delegation over the past 22 years, one at a time, and that he asked the Assembly's patience while he did so. No one interrupted. That itself was unusual. He started with grievance number 1, filed 22 years ago, a complaint about the original technology transfer agreement, in which Earth was given navigation software that the Conclave's own internal records that humans had spent years legally requesting access to, showed, was already marked for obsolescence at the time of transfer. He read the relevant record numbers. He cited the relevant legal articles. He stated the harm done to human exploration capacity. He moved to grievance number 2. He worked through all 47. It took a long time. The chamber stayed quiet. Some grievances were about technology. Some were about patrol assignments. Some were about diplomatic incidents, procedural exclusions, trade routes denied without stated reasons, requests for cultural exchange ignored or declined, colonies left outside emergency assistance coverage that was guaranteed to Tier 3 and above under Article 17 of the Conclave Charter. Each one was documented. Each one had a legal citation. Each one had a human cost attached to it, not expressed emotionally, but stated plainly. These people were affected. These resources were lost. This was the law that was supposed to prevent this from happening. By grievance number 30, the chamber was very still. The Vreth delegate, a younger counselor than Drav, who had retired the previous year, began preparing an objection. Before he could stand, Sohai leaned forward at the delegation table and set down a bound document. It was passed to the conclave secretary by a clerk. The secretary opened it. It contained, in order, 14 separate documented violations of conclave law committed by the Vreth Dominion in the last 10 years. Each one was supported by records that Earth had collected quietly, legally, over many years. None of them had ever been submitted before. They had been saved, for this moment. The Vreth delegate sat back down. Junho reached grievance number 47. He read it the same way he had read the others. Then he closed his record and was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had one more item to present. He submitted Earth's application for Tier 1 reclassification. The chamber broke open, not in anger, in pure noise. Dozens of delegates speaking at once, to each other, to their staff, to no one. Even the Elhari, who were usually the calmest species in any room, were exchanging rapid words. A few delegates stood without being recognized by the chair. The session chair had to call for order 3 times before the room came down. The application was not just a request. It was a legal motion. Junho had prepared it with the help of a legal team that had spent 4 years on nothing else. The motion cited 63 precedents from conclave legal history, some of them centuries old, all of them supporting the same principle, that tier classification was based on demonstrated capacity in engineering, diplomacy, military competence, and long-term civic stability. For each criterion, the motion presented evidence. Ships, technology, the diplomatic record, the fact that 22 years of grievances had been compiled in perfect legal form without a single procedural error, the fact that Earth had, on multiple occasions, maintained restraint in situations where escalation would have been legally defensible. The Elhari Collective's senior counselor, not Vale but his superior, a very old counselor named Priath who had been in the chamber longer than most species in it, asked to speak. She said that she had read Vale's investigation report. She said she had read it 3 times. She said that the Elhari Collective was prepared to support the motion. The vote was called. It was not unanimous. The Vreth Dominion voted against. 2 smaller species that had close trade ties with the Vreth voted against. Several others abstained, unwilling to commit fully in either direction, but the majority voted in favor. The count was confirmed by the session chair. The result was entered into the official record. Earth was reclassified, Tier 1, permanent seat, voting rights, full access to the primary relay network. The chamber was quiet after the count, not the tense quiet of before, a different kind, the kind that follows something that can't be undone. The Vreth delegate stood for one last attempt. He spoke in a tight, controlled voice and said that humanity was still a young species, that they were reactive and emotional, that 30 years was nothing in the scope of galactic history, that giving a young, volatile species this level of access and power was a risk the Conclave had not fully considered. He said it with the confidence of someone who had said similar things many times and been agreed with. Deal, who had not spoken once during the entire session, looked at the Vreth delegate. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, clearly enough for the whole chamber to hear without shouting, "You had centuries to be kind to us. You weren't. We had 30 years to prepare for that. We were." The Vreth delegate had no response to that. He sat down. The session was closed. Delegates began to leave the chamber. Some stopped to speak with the Earth delegation. Some simply looked at them as they passed, not with contempt, not with the easy dismissal of before, but with something more careful. Something that was still working out how to name itself. Minyu and Sohai spoke with 3 other delegations near the chamber doors. Deal stood off to one side and said nothing to anyone, which seemed to be his preference. Yoonji, who had traveled to the station as a civilian liaison and sat in the observation deck for the whole session, came down to the floor and stood near the delegation table for a while without saying much. She didn't need to. Hyun waited until the chamber was nearly empty. Then he turned to Junho, who was standing at the delegation table going through his papers one more time, and asked how long he had expected this to take. Junho didn't look up from his papers immediately. He set a document down, straightened it against the table, and then looked at Hyun. He said that he had filed the first grievance when he was 29 years old. He said that he was 51 now. He said that it had been faster than he hoped and slower than they deserved. Hyun nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. Outside the wide observation windows of the chamber, the old red star burned dimly in the distance. The relay lanes ran through the dark in every direction. The fast ones, the good ones, the ones that cut travel time in half and connected civilizations, and carried the signals that kept things working. The ones Earth could now use. They had always been there, right there, just outside reach. Not anymore. 6 months after the vote, the galaxy was still adjusting. Not loudly, not in dramatic ways that anyone could point to on a single day and say, this is when everything changed. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of change that happens the way water changes rock, slowly, steadily, and in ways that only become visible when you step back and look at the shape of what's left. Earth's delegation moved to the upper tier of the assembly chamber. Their new seats were closer to the center. The first time Junho sat in them, he didn't look around much. He just placed his documents on the table and waited for the session to begin. He had spent 22 years learning not to make moments bigger than they needed to be. He wasn't going to start now. The relay lanes were a different matter. The first time a human cargo ship used the Tier 1 fast lanes, the transit time from Earth to the outer colonies dropped from 11 days to 4. The colonists in the far settlements had been waiting 11 days for supplies, for medical shipments, for replacement parts, for letters from family, for everything, for their entire lives, because that was how long it had always taken. Now it took 4. The people who ran the supply route said it didn't feel real at first. They kept checking the navigation logs. The logs kept saying the same thing. Nari was in a different kind of meeting now. The Elhari had approached Earth 6 weeks after the reclassification with a proposal for a joint engineering project, a next-generation relay station that would be built using both species' technical teams. Nari had been assigned to lead Earth's side of it. She was in a planning room on the Elhari home station when her counterpart, a thin, careful engineer named Sale, who had studied human technical documents for 2 years before the meeting, asked her how humanity had developed their propulsion approach without access to proper base materials. Nari turned the question over in her mind for a while. She had been asked versions of it many times since the reclassification. She always tried to give an honest answer. She said, "We didn't learn, we just never stopped." Sale wrote it down. He asked what she meant. She said that learning implies there is a point where you know enough and you can stop. She said humans had never reached that point and had stopped looking for it. She said that every limitation they ran into became a question instead of a wall, not because they were exceptional, because stopping felt worse than continuing. Sale was quiet for a moment. Then he said that this was a very strange way to exist. Nari said she knew. She said they had been told that before. On a much smaller scale, in a much quieter part of the galaxy, something else was beginning. Sohai had started receiving messages, not official ones, personal ones, through channels that required several forwarded hops to reach her. They came from junior delegates and civilian liaisons attached to smaller species that had been in the conclave for a long time without gaining much from the membership. Species that had been assigned to their own version of the outer reach. Species that had filed their own grievances that had sat in the same low-priority queue as Earth's for years, unread and unanswered. They were asking for guidance. Not military guidance, not technical help. They wanted to know how Earth had used the Conclave's own legal framework to build a case. They wanted to know which articles were most relevant. They wanted to know how to document properly, how to cite precisely, how to build a record that couldn't be dismissed. They were asking because they had watched what Earth did in that chamber and understood that the tools had always been there. The rules, the procedures, the legal structures that the powerful had written assuming that only the powerful would use them. And now they were wondering if they could use them too. Sohai brought the messages to Hyun. He was 24, technically still an aide, practically running half the diplomatic office at this point. She showed him the messages and asked him what he thought. He read through them carefully. He said he thought they should answer every one. She asked him if he had the time. He said he would make the time. They called it the Coalition of the Unheard, though that name came later, when other people started describing it from outside. At the beginning, it was just two people in a small office staying up past midnight, writing back to strangers from other worlds, explaining, patiently, clearly, in whatever standard dialect the recipient was most comfortable with, how to write a grievance that someone would have to answer. Yoonji heard about it and asked if she could help. She had been working as a civilian liaison for 3 months by then, sitting in on meetings, learning the structure, making herself useful in the way she had always made herself useful, by paying attention to things other people walked past. She said she thought she understood what it felt like to need someone to show up. She said she thought she could explain that in a way that other species might understand. Sohai said yes immediately. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Yoonji traveled to the site of the Hisal attack. She went with a small team, 2 other crew members who had survived the attack, and a junior liaison officer who had never seen the outer reach before. The site was empty space now, just coordinates. No wreckage remaining, no markers. Just the location, recorded in navigation logs as the place where it happened. Yoonji floated in the observation window of the shuttle for a long time, looking at the empty space. Then she went to the cargo hold and took out the marker she had brought from Earth, a simple metal post with a small engraved plate, the kind that was used in human memorial gardens. The crew planted it on a small piece of debris that was still drifting at the coordinates, the only physical remnant left. The plate had 17 names on it, the names of the people who had not come back. She recorded a short message and broadcast it on open conclave frequencies. She said that she was standing at the place where 17 people had been killed because no one had thought their lives needed immediate attention. She said she was not broadcasting out of anger. She said she was broadcasting because remembering was the only way to make sure something was real, and the only way to make sure real things were not forgotten. She said she hoped whoever was listening would find someone worth remembering and tell them so while they still could. Some species in the conclave found the gesture confusing. The Vreth ignored it, but 6 other delegations sent small teams to stand at the coordinates. They brought their own markers. They did not say much. They stood there for a while, then they left. Minyu gave one interview in the months following the reclassification to a young galactic historian who was compiling the official record of the events. The historian asked him what the most important thing was that humans had understood about galactic politics that other species hadn't. Minyu didn't have to think about it, he said. Patience and passivity are not the same thing. He said that every other species that had been mistreated in the conclave had either fought back immediately and been crushed for it, or accepted the treatment quietly until they disappeared from relevance. He said humans had done neither. He said humans had waited deliberately, purposefully, eyes open, until they were ready. He said the galaxy had looked at that waiting and assumed it meant surrender. The historian asked what it had actually meant. Minyu looked out the window. He looked at the relay lanes running through the dark. He said arithmetic. The historian asked him to explain. Minyu said there was nothing to explain. He said that arithmetic was what you did when you kept exact records of everything owed and everything paid and everything still outstanding. He said that arithmetic was patient by nature. He said that arithmetic always arrived at the same answer, no matter how long the calculation took. The historian published the interview 6 months later. It was read widely. The Vreth Dominion released no public response to it, but their diplomatic communications in the following year showed a marked change in how they addressed smaller species in the conclave. Careful people noticed. Sohai was one of them. She kept records of it. She kept records of everything now. In Busan, Junho retired from active diplomatic service on a Tuesday. He spent his first morning home walking by the sea. He stopped at a small place that sold coffee and sat outside for a while, watching the water. He was 51 years old and his back hurt, and he had spent 22 years in rooms where people talked at each other without listening, and somehow that had worked out. He thought about his father. He thought about the folders on the shelf at home, organized by year. In the afternoon, he sat at his desk and opened the official conclave record update on his datapad. He found Earth's listing. It said Tier 1, voting member, active participant in primary governance structure. He looked at it for a moment. He did not smile. He set the datapad down. He reached into the desk drawer and took out a blank grievance form. The same template he had been using for 22 years. He set it on the desk and picked up a pen. There were new injustices in the conclave. There were always new injustices. New species being ignored, new rules being bent, new people in new versions of the same old seats being told that their concerns would be reviewed in 4 years, maybe 5. He wrote the date at the top of the form. He wrote clearly. He wrote simply. The difference was that now, when he filed it, someone had to answer. And they knew, all of them, the entire conclave, every species in every tier, that if they didn't answer, the humans would remember. They would always remember. And they were very, very good at collecting.